If you're looking for real Buddha quotes, this is the place. We'll have 10 for you coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, consider subscribing. So if you look around the web and around YouTube, you'll find a number of places that purport to give you Buddha quotes. And some of them, I'm sure, are quite good. I checked a couple myself before making this video and found a lot of what seemed to me not quite accurate ones. So what I'm going to try to do here is to give real Buddha quotes, that is, quotes where I'm going to actually give you where you find the quote so that you can actually look for it yourself and verify it if you really want to. I'll put links down below in the information box also to texts that have those quotes in them, so you can see them in context, because you get a lot out of the context. And another thing is that a number of these other sort of Buddha quotes that I've seen around the web, they tend to be sort of inspirational, sort of poster type material, sort of things that you would find on a dorm room wall. And what I'm going to try to pick is sort of more pungent, interesting, maybe even slightly controversial kinds of examples, so to make you think, rather than just the sort of thing you put on a wall and stop seeing after a couple of minutes. So the first one is a famous one from the Dhammapada, which reads, "Hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. This is a law eternal." Hatred, of course, is one of the three fires, the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion, that we're trying to overcome with Buddhist practice. And, of course, the way most people try to appease hatred is through hatred. That is, somebody does something hateful, and we try to respond, or we tend to respond with hatred ourselves. This is a perfectly normal and natural way of responding. It's the way I respond many times, but it's not skillful. And that's what the Buddha is saying, that this just doesn't work. We have to respond to hatred through non-hatred, through compassion, through caring, through loving kindness if we can. And if we can't manage any of those, at least to respond with equanimity, without trying to make things worse. So, second Buddha quote. "If there were a mountain made of gold, made entirely of solid gold, not double this would suffice for one. Having known this, go peacefully." Greed and ambition are not ultimately satisfiable. Even if we wanted a mountain of gold, even if we wanted an entire mountain just of solid gold, getting it would not satisfy us. Even if we had two of them, it wouldn't satisfy us. So, insofar as we're thinking that we're going to appease our sense of greed, our sense of desire for things, and insofar as we think we're going to appease our ambition by getting what we think we want, we're wrong. Because even if we got what we wanted, we would still have that ambition. That ambition is something that's rooted much deeper than the getting of things will overcome. Okay, so the third quote, and this is from a very famous sutta. "It is impossible that one engage in sensual pleasures without sensual desires, without perceptions of sensual desire, without thoughts of sensual desire." So here the Buddha is basically responding to one of his monastics who believed that he could engage in sensual pleasures, in particular sexual activity, without it sort of hindering his normal progress along the path, and in particular his monastic practice. And what the Buddha is saying here is that sensual pleasures, insofar as we indulge in them, always have their downside. They always promote a kind of clinging and attachment. So if we indulge our sensual pleasures for good food, for a good drink, for good parties, for beautiful places, we get attached to them. That's just a normal feature of life. And there's no way of overcoming that through the indulgence in pleasures themselves, or indulgence in pleasures themselves, I should say. So if we indulge in pleasures, we're going to tend to get attached to them. And that's part of what we realize through practice. And so what we have to find through practice is a way of dealing with sensual pleasures such that we aren't indulging in them. So the fourth Buddha quote, and this is from the same sutta as the last one. "The Dhamma is similar to a raft, being for the purpose of crossing over, not for the purpose of grasping." So just as we can grasp at sensual pleasures, like we saw with the last quote, Here we're talking about grasping for something slightly different. It's a different kind of pleasure, if you like. It's a kind of mental pleasure. It's a kind of pleasure of good thoughts, of good ideas. And here the Dhamma can be thought of as good thoughts, good ideas, and people, as a result, finding them pleasurable, tend to grasp at them. And if we grasp at them, that basically means we are identifying with them. I mean, part of grasping is identifying ourselves with them, is seeing ourselves in them. That we see ourselves as sort of reflected in the Dharma, and see the Dharma as reflected in us. And so what happens then if we grasp at these things rather than using them as practice is that we become identified with them, and as we're identified with them, we take it personally if they're attacked, or if somebody disagrees with us, or if we have to convince somebody. And the place where this occurs in the sutta is basically where the Buddha is talking about arguments and disputes, that we get into arguments and disputes with other people. And that's because we're grasping the Dharma, and we sort of identify with it. Somebody comes up and disagrees with us. We feel hurt. We feel personally offended by them. And as a result, we get into arguments and disputes. And arguments and disputes, of course, are promoted by hatred and anger and enmity with other people. We tend to think of people as our enemies when we're in an argument or a dispute. And what the Buddha is saying here is we should use the Dharma in a particular way. We should use it as a practice. And that as we, of course, while we're practicing, we're going to have to cling to it to a certain degree, the way we cling to a raft while we're in the river. But we should be aware that as we reach the goal of our practice, that part of the goal, part of the practice is going to be actually letting go of this stuff. Not to say that we think it's false, not to say that we think it's useless. Of course, it is useful. It's very useful. It's a good raft. But once we've reached the shore of practice, the farther shore, then we can set it aside. We don't need to identify with it. Okay, the fifth simile. And here we're getting back once again to issues of compassion and kindness. Very shocking simile. Even if low-down bandits were to sever you limb from limb with a two-handled saw, anyone who had a malevolent thought on that account would not be following my instructions. And here's an example of a quote which is extremely profound and pithy and shocking. It's not the sort of quote you're really going to find on a poster in somebody's dorm room. But the point of it is really quite emphatic and, I think, far-reaching. The point is that we tend to... I should also say that in the context of this quote, the Buddha is talking to some monastics of his who have gotten into an argument with somebody else about, as I recall, something having to do with the Dharma, although it doesn't really matter. And so they go to the Buddha to discuss this, and the Buddha basically says, look, people may berate you for certain things. They may berate you for being a monastic in a certain kind of community that doesn't like monastics. But it's just words. And even if somebody were really to do something very bad to you, you still shouldn't have a mind of hatred, because hatred itself is a kind of a poison. So on that same note, we'll look at the sixth quote, which is the quote from the Sutta on Loving Kindness. Just as a mother would protect her son, her only son, with her own life, so one should develop toward all beings a state of mind without boundaries. And toward the whole world one should develop loving kindness, a state of mind without boundaries, above, below, and across, unconfined, without enmity, without adversaries. So the practice of developing this mind of loving kindness is to try to instigate in ourselves an emotion that we can think of as similar to an emotion of a mother towards her only child. And try to expand that emotion towards everything, boundlessly. That is to say, normally we might do this in a way that is bounded. In other words, we'll say, we'll extend it towards certain people, but not towards others. We'll put a boundary around others. We'll extend it towards our family and friends, let's say, but not towards people from that country, or people from that state, or people from that city, or people with those beliefs. That's the way we standardly tend to think of this kind of emotional state. And what the Buddha is suggesting is that we expand this emotional state boundlessly, and he repeats that. It's a boundless state. It's a state without boundaries, where we're not making enemies of anybody. At least in our minds. At least that's the practice. We're trying our best not to think of anybody as an enemy. And this is a very profound, I think, and deep practice, and difficult, of course. It's very difficult for us to even begin the practice, much less complete it. But it's one that I think has great benefits along the way. Our seventh Buddha quote is a sort of a lengthy one, but it's a very, very famous one. His discussion with the Kalamas about how we should know about the world. Kalamas being a group of people he went to give a talk to who were very confused about what they should believe and what they shouldn't believe, because all kinds of people coming through their territory and telling them different things. And so the Buddha says to them, "Come, Kalamas, do not go by oral tradition, by lineage of teaching, by hearsay, by a collection of scriptures, by logical reasoning, inferential reasoning, reasoned cognition, by the acceptance of a view after pondering it." These are all, of course, ways that one can accept a view. Or by the seeming competence of a speaker. Or because you think this ascetic is our guru, our teacher. But when you know for yourselves, these things are wholesome, these things are blameless, these things are praised by the wise. These things, if accepted and undertaken, lead to welfare and happiness. Then you should live in accordance with them. And of course, there's a lot here. I can't go into all of it because I'm just talking about quotes here. But in basic, what he's saying is we shouldn't simply go by tradition, or we shouldn't believe things only based on tradition or only based on somebody's say-so, or simply because somebody happens to be our teacher. Instead, we should always investigate teachings for ourselves in our own lives and see if they lead to our own welfare and happiness, and the welfare and happiness, of course, of people around us. And ask ourselves, are these the kind of teachings that the wise, people we consider wise, would approve of? Or are they the kinds of teachings they wouldn't? And by keeping these in mind, I think we can go a long way towards overcoming some questionable teachings that we may hear from some people. Okay, number 8. And this is a very famous one, very central to Buddhist thinking. All conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. This is the path to purification. And this highlights the central place of impermanence within the Buddhist worldview that we notice through looking around, through opening our eyes and our ears and looking around and paying attention, that all things are impermanent. That kind of awareness of the impermanence of things should lead our mind in certain directions towards seeing certain kinds of actions and activities and mind states as being wise and others as being less wise. Our 9th Buddha quote, "Be your own island, your own refuge, with no other refuge. Let the teaching be your island and your refuge, with no other refuge." And this is something that the Buddha is reported to have said soon before he died. He may have said it other times as well, but he said it at that time in particular, which highlights, I think, the importance of this particular teaching, that at the end of the day, we can't really rely upon others to do the work for us. We should have ourselves as our refuge and our island, and we should, of course, have the Dharma as a refuge as well. That is the teaching that helps us to see the way forward, that helps us to understand the kind of path that we ought to be on towards wisdom and towards a better, a wiser, a kinder, and a less stress-filled life. And finally, the 10th Buddha quote, and this is from the Dhammapada, "You yourselves must strive. The Buddhas only point the way." The Buddhas here we can understand as the people who have attained awakening, or in a more broad sense, the wise people. And at the end of the day, there are some people who are wise. Whether or not they've attained awakening, there are certain people who are wiser than we are. But they can only point the way. They can't do the work for us. We have to do the practice. We have to sit down on our cushions or our chairs, do the meditation practice, do the other kinds of thought and action practices that are recommended by wise teachers like the Buddha. And while some people may include, let's say, devotional practices within those, they may include kinds of prayer within those. Certainly these kinds of devotional or prayer practices did occur in later forms of Buddhism. They certainly occur in other religions. But at the end of the day, these, according to the Buddha anyway, these are not magical. In other words, we can do devotions, but at the end of the day, we have to do the work ourselves. It's not that other beings will do the work for us if we're devotional. It may be that the devotion itself is a kind of practice that helps us, let's say, to break down ego and so on, but then the practice is the devotion, not that something will help us magically. And the same with prayer. Now, there's a great contemporary Buddhist teacher named Bodhi Paksha who talks about fake Buddha quotes. And he has a website where he comes up with, he finds Buddha quotes, or at least claimed Buddha quotes from around the web, or around wherever he can find them, and if they aren't accurate, he will put them there and discuss why they aren't accurate and where they probably come from. And I'll put a link to that website down below. Bodhi Paksha is also coming out with a book. I believe it'll probably be out by the time this video is out, talking about fake Buddha quotes, and I'll put a link as well to that book down below if you're interested in looking at that, because some of them are really quite funny. I won't repeat them here because I don't want to muddy the waters, because I know the way people tend to think, they'll tend to mix them together. So I'm not going to repeat them, but if you're interested, you can go and find them. Finally, I know that there are some people watching this video who are going to be left with a very, what they feel is a very important question, which is, how do we know the Buddha said any of these things? And at the end of the day, we can never know for sure, because the Buddha, of course, lived 2,500 years ago. When he gave his discourses, they were then remembered by his students, his monastics. The monastics then memorized them. They then continued that sort of memorization, oral tradition for probably over a century, maybe over 2 centuries, before they were really written down. That's a long period of time. And of course, even after they were written down, then of course the writing had to be rewritten down and copied and so on. There's a lot of room for error, there's a lot of room for mistakes, a lot of room for people to make stuff up, which people do. And we know from various different traditions that there are different versions of these texts that don't quite match up in all of their particulars by any means. So yes, we don't know for sure whether the Buddha said any of these. What we do know is that these are, the quotes that I've given you, are from the Pali Canon, which is the oldest complete version of the Buddha's supposed sayings, written in a language which is either identical to or very close to a language that the Buddha himself would have spoken. So these are as close as we're going to get. That's all you can say. And the more scholarly among us may say that certain of the ones in the Pali Canon are more accurate than others. I'll leave that for another time. The point is, these are as good as we can get. So if you're interested in these kinds of discussions around early Buddhism and what the Buddha might have said, check out my Patreon page where I put up interesting, fun things I find around the web and discuss them. That'll help support the channel as well. Thanks so much for being here. If you have any other questions about these quotes or other ones you want to bring up, put them down below in the comments section. I always love reading them, and I think a lot of other people do as well. So thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. Meanwhile, be well.